The apostles are those who stand at the top of the world, collectively known as the 12 super beings. The story says that each of the apostles, dressed in a blue cloak with a deep hood, was incredibly strong. Some could control water comparable in volume to the oceans, others opposed entire human empires. Moreover, they could create new worlds from their flesh and blood, cradling them in their arms like babies. Among them is the most powerful apostle named Yolman, who has limitless power. According to records, his combat power is far superior to other apostles, but its origin is unknown. The highest category of danger is designated as an apostle, but when the apostles themselves disappeared, they gradually began to be forgotten, remembered only in legends. The dark-haired guy, dressed in a formal suit and cape, sneezed loudly. Scratching his nose, he looked back at the icy mountains with snow caps surrounding him, and thought displeasedly that soldiers would quickly come into this cold and fight this small dragon. Ice Dragon Warcraft. Category Disaster. The most dangerous category in the existing Warcraft classification, has great destructive power. The brunette watched as the Ice Dragon led various monsters of the north into the Thunderfield. To protect national security, the Guam Empire immediately deployed its troops to defend it. This battle will begin soon. The human warriors talked among themselves. Some asked whether their temporary detachment could win. Others answered that only God knew the answer to this question. Finally, the cry of a warrior on the front line was heard, which started the battle. Armored people, waving swords in one hand and holding shields in the other, roared towards the army of monsters led by the Ice Dragon. Huge giants brought down the power of their fists on them. Raising his head and opening his mouth in surprise, the knight watched as birds of prey rushed at him from above with a deafening roar. The human army, like toy figures, flew away from the blows of the enemies. The dragon, sparkling with its red eyes, crushed knights right and left with its sharp wings. The guy stood on a high slope and, seeing the squad running away in horror, muttered that these soldiers were not opponents of monsters. Thoughtfully putting his finger to his lips, he thought that the disparity in combat power was too great. Most likely, the people would soon lose. Suddenly, as if out of nowhere, a red-haired stranger appeared in the battle arena, urging them not to panic. The brunette looked back in surprise when he heard a girl's voice in the icy mountains. She continued her speech by saying that just because the enemy is stronger does not mean that they are losing. Standing on the edge of the ice floe, she released a stream of fire directly from her palm upward. If she retreats now, then everything will definitely end in failure. Lowering her hand, the girl directed the fire directly towards the Ice Dragon. This frail-looking stranger was named Sierra Charlotte, one of the 4 great mages of the Guam Empire, known as the Fire Witch, was appointed to lead this army. The people perked up, exclaiming joyfully that now, thanks to Miss Sierra, they had a chance to win. Pointing her hand towards the monsters, Charlotte loudly gave the order to attack. With their fighting spirit high, the knights rushed to the offensive with renewed vigor. A snowstorm, immediately after the fiery stream, covered the dragon headlong with a huge shaft, and when the snow subsided, the predator's eyes narrowed dangerously. The dragon, flapping its wings, roared and rose up. People turned around in shock, and Sierra, who attacked him with a fiery explosion magic attack, could not believe that he was still moving. The animal released a large ice ball from its mouth, so that in the next second they would spew ice and snow onto the human army, which buried the warriors alive within themselves, killing them on the spot. The dragon flapped its wings, and the ice figures broke into several pieces right in the air. The Fire Witch, gritting her teeth, powerlessly watched the death of her army. Unable to bear it, she ran and jumped down, right into the thick of things. Raising a fiery sword above her, Sierra shouted that she, being a magician of the Guam Empire, would not allow the dragon to win. The monster turned toward the sound, its eyes flashing with rage. The girl's sword landed with a clang on the dragon's icy tail. Their gazes, full of rage, rested on each other. Each one, calling on magic, attacked the enemy with his weapon, but they were unable to touch each other. Charlotte jumped up, fleeing the ice attack. The girl landed confidently on the cold ground. She formed a circle of fire around herself, from which burning arrows separated, ready to fly at the ice monster at any second. He, without wasting time, released another frosty, deadly portion of a snowstorm from his insides. The witch rushed forward with a furious cry, followed by faithful arrows. The dragon, opening its fanged mouth, spewed out a magical ice ball. All that remained was to watch how the ice and fire rushed towards each other. Two elements collided in battle with a deafening sound, but the dragon's power turned out to be many times stronger, and the icy stream broke the circle of fire. With a squeak, Sierra realized she was trapped. The ice extinguished the flame in a matter of seconds and crushed the witch into an ice block. Charlotte fell into the snow with a thud. Wounded, she, clearing her throat, tried to roll over onto her stomach, but her body did not obey the girl. The knights watched the leader in shock. No one dared to come closer. One of the warriors began to cry in despair, asking what to do now, even if Lady Sierra lost. Someone's sword landed on the ground with a clang. The knight backed away, sobbing that he couldn't believe what he was seeing. He turned sharply and rushed out of the battlefield. They could not win. The others looked after him with their mouths open. Realizing that there was no point in resisting, the entire company ran away after their brother. Charlotte, still lying on the cold ground, held out her hands, trying to stop her fallen army. When she was able to sit down, she found herself completely alone in the icy desert. The girl's shoulders trembled with anger. Somehow, throwing off fiery sparks from herself, the witch managed to get to her feet. With just her lips she hissed words of hatred in the wake of the cowardly knights. Suddenly, behind her, she heard someone asking her why the witch didn't run away. Because there was no chance of winning at all. Charlotte turned around sharply. Who dared say such a thing? A guy stood in front of her, holding his hands in his trouser pockets, and smiling smugly, introduced himself as a man who wanted to earn a few gold coins here. Leaning forward a little, he repeated the question without ceasing to smile. Sierra shook her head, answering that the word runaway had never been in her vocabulary, and never would be. The stranger chuckled, putting his hand over his mouth, saying that while it was cute, they didn't have time to talk about it right now. The witch was not going to stop the argument, and defiantly asked what he was talking about, not seeing what was happening behind her back. Finally, she realized that she was distracted and turned around at the sound of flapping wings. At the same moment the dragon, opening his mouth, he attacked his opponents with ice magic. Sierra had no choice but to helplessly cover her face with her hands. Now it's all over. But for some reason, after a few seconds she realized that she was still alive and opened her eyes. Incredibly, the stranger literally held the monster with one hand, while the other still remained in his pocket. The guy loudly exclaimed that the dragon was bothering him. A shadow ran across his face, saying that he was talking to the miss, the brunette, with a casual movement threw the ice creature away from him. Because a small creature like this dragon should calm down. Having fallen on his back, the enemy, still rolling on the ground, comically kicked his paws in the air. He couldn't understand what happened a minute ago. Towing, he regained his balance and rolled over, digging into the ground with his claws. The dragon seemed to have doubled in size after the absurd defeat, bristled and now looked down at its tiny enemy. The stranger extended his hand, gathering his magic together. Smirking, he said that he seemed to have met a naughty dragon, while purple magical runes formed on his palm. The red eyes sparkled dangerously. Unfortunately for the dragon, he would soon be burned. It looked like the monster had never encountered anything like this before, and looked at the guy in bewilderment. Sierra couldn't believe her eyes. The purple whirlwind emanating from the palm of the puny stranger was spinning the dragon like a rag doll. Finally, a raging magical hurricane hid the huge figure of the enemy from view. When the purple haze cleared, a beautiful blue crystal remained in the air. It landed right in the brunette's palm. He threw a stone into the air, turned around and asked the witch if she would go on a date with him at the expense of her life saved. The girl, kneeling down, pressed her left hand over the wound on the forearm of her right hand. This impudent man was able to kill a disaster category monster with one movement. She felt something ringing in her head and her eyes closed. Having only had time to ask who he was, Charlotte leaned back unconscious. She was immediately picked up by a sudden savior. Bending over the girl, he said with a smile that he was a simple mercenary who decided to earn some gold coins. Yolman was the first among the apostles, nicknamed Limitless. Everything that was happening flashed before my eyes as if through a veil, a purple whirlwind in which the ice dragon met its death. The stranger looked over his shoulder with a caustic grin as he tossed the crystal into his palm. Sierra's eyes widened in horror. Abruptly sitting up in bed, she screamed and reached out with her hand for the ice dragon. She must catch it and kill it. But suddenly realization overwhelmed the girl. Her hands felt not the snow cover, but soft blankets. Where did she end up? The voice of the chief magician of the Empire of Guam Aces, the gray-haired director of the Royal Academy, was heard. He looked up from the book he was reading and asked the witch how she was feeling, because she had been sleeping for several days. Sierra, clutching the blanket, asked the director with a desperate cry what happened to the ice dragon. The old man slammed the book shut, answering that the dragon had been destroyed, and Charlotte herself needed to lie down, rest, and not worry about anything. The lenses of his glasses sparkled as the man looked closely at Sierra and asked what happened in the end and how the monster died. Biting her lip, Charlotte frantically tried to remember at least something, but she couldn't do it. Aces chuckled under his breath. That's how it is. He brought a thing to the girl that looked like a small finger-sized lamp with a purple light burning in it, and asked her to take a closer look. Charlotte stared at the flame in shock. The magician said that when he arrived on the battlefield, the fire was next to the witch. Even when Sierra did not come to her senses, it did not disappear. Hellfire is a flame that people will never be able to manipulate unless it is. The witch clenched her teeth angrily and finished the director's speech. If it's not an apostle. The man, fingering the strands of his long beard, said that the apostles had been missing for a long time, but since Hellfire appeared in this battle, it means they clearly don't know something. The aces placed the book on the table before leaving the room. Finally, he told the silently sitting witch that she had done a good job and she should rest, so he left so as not to disturb her. The old man, without turning around, said that in addition, the Empire would claim that it was Charlotte's squad that defeated the ice dragon. Then he finally turned around and smiled, consoling the downcast Sierra. In the end, anything related to the apostles will cause a lot of unnecessary panic, so the girl should just accept all the honors and praise. She, squeezing the blanket with all her strength, whispered to the now empty room that she would do this. The people, gathered at the walls of the academy, enthusiastically greeted Sierra and thanked her for her victory. Meanwhile, in the city tavern, one of the military detachments gathered to have a feast. Yolman sat in the corner of the bar, holding his forehead with his palm. He was worried that there would be an uproar when his identity was revealed. But then it dawned on the guy, he would never see cute girls who would treat him like a hero, because the apostle came to the human world to find himself a girl. Throwing a bag of things over his shoulder, he got ready to leave, and thought that he needed to leave this city and hide somewhere. Meanwhile, a detachment of Imperial soldiers was heading towards the doors of the tavern. Tears appeared in the brunette's eyes as he said goodbye to his favorite tavern and the beautiful lady behind the bar. The knights approached the door of the bar, and the leading warrior, a blond man in a red cloak, loudly asked those present which of them was a mercenary. Everyone in the tavern, looking around, simultaneously pointed their fingers at Yolman, who was trying to hide. The guy froze. Has he really been discovered? The commander-in-chief loudly reported that Yolman was now invited to take part in the entrance test to the Royal Academy. The warriors buzzed with displeasure. This is the best academy in the Guam Empire, and this guy only recently came here. Why was he invited? In response to the outrage, the man asked a counter-question. Did everyone present here participate in the battle against the ice dragon along with this man? The faces of the warriors stretched out. Is this really about the recent battle against the ice dragon? Someone said in the ensuing silence that only a handful of people survived there, and this guy was one of them. The man in the red cloak pointed at Yolman. Besides all this, the guy turned out to be safe and sound in the battle. He asked if the soldiers had any questions. They fell silent again. Yolman raised his hand sharply. Clenching his fist, he exhaled and asked if there were many beautiful girls in this academy. The commander-in-chief was confused. He clearly did not expect such a question. Meanwhile, young beauties in short school uniforms that did not hide their thighs and high stockings actually studied at the academy. The elastic chest rose in time with the girls' breathing. Yes, the Royal Academy of the Guam Empire could boast of its hand-picked students. Yolman was in Rio Paradise. Aces stood on the balcony with the commander-in-chief, who asked the director why he decided to train an incompetent mercenary. The old man, squinting his eyes good-naturedly, replied that young people should be given the opportunity to prove themselves. The magician watched the young man spin like a spinning top, looking at the pretty girls, and continued that these people may have unexpected talents. Yolman did not notice anything around, looking around the short skirts with a loving gaze. Ace's voice rang out loudly in the hall. He congratulated those in the building for getting a chance to enter the Royal Academy, and in order to understand whether they were suitable for the academy, the entrance test would begin right now. The man added that he hoped that the candidates would do everything in their power to pass and survive, at which time various pentagrams painted in red began to appear on the floor. Those present began to talk worriedly. What did he mean? How to survive? Suddenly, huge clawed paws began to appear from the magic circles. Furious clattering could be heard from everywhere, and fiery demonic wolves appeared from the runes, summoning beasts that only experienced fire mages could summon. Trembling with fear, the candidates asked each other if this training would kill them. At the end of the hall, having acquired the habit of calling all the pretty girls sisters, Yolman assured one of them that he would protect her, and that there was no reason to worry. The crowd scattered as a pack of fiery wolves rushed at them. Some still did not do anything, not believing that this was a real monster. The apostle, putting his hands in his pockets, chuckled boredly. Is it really worth making such a fuss over such a small fish? One of the candidates tried to throw off panic and began to cast magic. He encouraged the others to work together to show what they were capable of, creating runes in the air with confident movements. Many dark vines began to burst out from his palms, but they turned out to be nothing to the wolves. They easily jumped up, playfully, avoiding the trap. Someone from the crowd released their currents at the enemies, but the fire wolves dealt with this even faster than with the vines. One of the magicians widened his eyes. He never expected such an outcome of events. What no one could have imagined was that one of the wolves would run up to a nearby guy and tear off his head with one jerk, licking his bloody mouth. The pink-haired witch shook in horror when this happened very close to her. Future students scattered when it became clear that this was not an imitation. The fire wolves really decided to kill everyone. Desperate cries were heard calling for escape. Yolman still didn't seem to understand what was happening and awkwardly stomped around the wall. Suddenly someone loudly called the fleeing people fools. A tall, long-haired blonde in uniform, who had been silent until then, created a shield between himself and the wolves, shouting that in such a situation, a mass exodus is really a stupid decision, as how people become the target of enemies. With a wave of his hands, he created magical air targets. They tightly enveloped the unsuspecting animals. Then the stranger ordered the fleeing candidates to attack the wolves. This worked. The future students divided into their battle groups. The archers attacked with arrows from the left flank. Mages should attack from the right flank. The swordsmen are right in the center. A huge amount of magic and fighting forces attacked the entire flock at the same time. A moment later, the immobilized monsters lay whining in different corners of the hall. The overjoyed candidates saluted each other and high-fived. They did it. Loud cries of joy were heard from everywhere that they really managed to win. But unfortunately, this was not the case. Red fiery figures were approaching the crowd. This wasn't the end, oh no. The flock suddenly merged together in a huge bloody and fiery dance. The future students raised their heads, watching in horror what was happening. He appeared from the flames, the fiery wolf Cerberus, several heads protruding from one body, ready to tear apart anyone who approached. Mages and warriors pointed swords and wands at the monster. Cerberus watched them, spewed flame, and was itself made of it. Inspired candidates were ready to jump into action. The blonde noticed that this was really a royal academy, since they used such a dangerous monster for a test. The monster, growling, released fireballs straight from its body into the crowd. The candidates frantically thought about how to protect themselves from the flying fire, but the force of the attack was so great that it instantly knocked the warriors off their feet. Yolman, who was watching this, who had not moved from his place from the very beginning of the battle, felt that one of the clumps was flying at him. Without even taking his hands out of his pockets, he shrugged. Such a weak attack, it's not even worth paying attention to. But the rest made so much noise because of this. Suddenly he saw a shadow above him, of someone else's female breast. Yolman raised his head, blushing deeply. The stranger ran straight at him, pushing him away from the burning attack. Still red as a lobster, the guy looked reverently at the stranger lying on him. White hair tied with a bow and huge eyes of a girl who examined the rescued one. She got up on her knees, telling him to be careful, because he was almost hit. The girl hovered over him and asked if everything was okay. Yolman could only open and close his mouth. There was another explosion, showering the couple with shards of glass and walls. The girl, rising to her feet, moved away from Yolman, but turned around and wished him to be more careful next time. The discouraged guy sat on the step and watched as the fragile stranger came closer to Cerberus, saying that the rest should be left to her. The apostle blushed again. She was really worried about him. Thoughts about the battle faded into the background for him. Pressing his palms to his face, he realized that some feeling made his heart beat faster. Meanwhile, the blonde girl swung her hand and created an ice boomerang. and the next moment she threw him at the monster. Ice boomerangs attacked the demonic dog from all sides. Crouching, the stranger created a large magic circle. Lianas began to creep towards Cerberus, enveloping their powerful paws. The rest of the warriors stood up menacingly. Their help should not be forgotten either. The girl asked to distract Cerberus for a while so that she could use a restraining spell. The crowd moved towards the dog from different angles, attacking with swords, arrows, and magic. The angry Cerberus rushed with all his heads at his opponents, throwing them to the sides. Meanwhile, the witch jumped into the vacated space to create a powerful attack spell from there. The magic circle hung directly above Cerberus's head. The dog raised his head and spewed streams of fire in that direction. The girl stretched out her hands and created ice shackles. First, ice crystals stretched under Cerberus, shackling the dog's paws. Then, from above, from the magic circle, collars fell out for each of the monster's heads. Cerberus found himself trapped in ice with ice collars on his necks and paws shackled by ice flows. The surprised candidates opened their mouths. Did she really succeed? Yolman smiled dreamily. The test should be completed soon, and he himself would definitely talk to this young lady later. Sierra, standing in the distance, grinned. No, this is not the end. Suddenly, a powerful stream of fire flew right next to the blonde witch's face. She turned around sharply, not understanding what was happening. Right behind her, Cerberus was burning all the created ice magic with hellish fire. Clattering the teeth of its 3 mouths, it chewed through the collars and trampled the ice under its paws. The girl jumped to the side. What kind of flame is this? The blonde who had attacked Cerberus earlier shouted that some fool had used fire magic. His hair flew up as the guy created a powerful wind barrier that blocked the flames. The crowd buzzed. Could he really cope with the fire? What amazing wind magic! Currents of air picked up the dog and lifted him up. Yolman said to himself that the wind cannot extinguish the flame, but it can restrain it. Has this man really calculated such subtleties? Despite this, after a few seconds Cerberus was free and ran towards the blonde witch. The girl cowered in fear as a huge shadow approached her. Nascent magic flashed in her palm and immediately went out. It had not yet recovered. Yolman came to the fore. This was his chance to show himself. He suddenly appeared right in front of the witch, grinning victoriously in advance. She screamed in surprise. Grabbing the stranger by the shoulder, he pulled her towards him. Turning away from Cerberus, Yolman pressed the witch, whispering that her dear little sister should not be afraid. The apostle's red eyes sparkled with anticipation. He pathetically said that this wild dog just needed to be kicked so that it would finally shut up, and put his left hand forward, squeezing the girl in his right. From powerful magic, Cerberus flew sharply into the opposite wall and landed on it with a roar, destroying the surface. Yolman chuckled. This is how he should charm his sister. Lowering his head, he saw how her face turned red and her eyes filled with tears. Without letting go of the witch, he worriedly asked if he had hurt her while he was kicking this dog. She, without moving, tearfully asked to finally let her go. And only then Yolman realized what kind of softness and elasticity he had felt in his hand for a long time. The blonde witch pressed her fists into his chest and turned her head away, asking him not to touch her. The apostle, blushing, quickly walked away and put his hands forward, apologizing and assuring that he did not do it on purpose. Both, blushing, stood at a distance from each other. The other guys, watching this scene, were indignant. How did this bastard dare to use such a moment to touch the goddess? And when did he even manage to approach her? A clear female voice was heard. At this stage, their test was completed. The crowd parted and a beautiful, stately woman appeared in front of those present. She stood at the destroyed steps, her hands folded on her chest. One of the candidates, covered in scratches and with charred clothes here and there, asked in surprise who she was. The stranger sternly introduced herself. Sarah, deputy director. The blonde, who attacked Cerberus with his strong magic, reproachfully asked the woman what the hell happened here. But she was surprised by the question. Then the guy pointed his finger at the lifeless body of one of the students. Is it really possible that an ordinary test for the Royal Academy can simply kill people? Sarah narrowed her eyes and smiled mysteriously. Before the blonde had time to blink an eye, the deputy director seemed to be drawing out with magic all the destruction, human and those that touched the building itself. Moreover, from the way the supposedly dead students gradually disappeared, it became clear that this was just an illusion. Tossing her long hair, the woman held translucent cards in her hands and laughed. What did they say about the students? The blonde stared at Sarah in bewilderment. Is this really the magic of puppets? The warriors were talking among themselves that there were rumors about the deputy director of the Royal Academy, who could control objects using magic. Sarah stepped forward and said that now that everything was settled, she wanted to say a few words. First of all, the vice principal wanted to congratulate the remaining people for passing the test and being accepted into the Royal Academy of Guam Ace class. Yolman's ears perked up as a couple of pretty students began to discuss the fact that Ace's class was taught by a great wizard, and who would be doing it this year. The guy's eyes lit up. What if she turned out to be his cute little sister? Sarah caught everyone's attention again. She was announcing the teacher of Ace's class. A shock of red hair flashed before Yolman's eyes. He took a step back in surprise. The vice principal introduced Sierra Charlotte, the new class leader and the person in charge of the students. She looked sternly at those present with her blue eyes. The blonde which opened her mouth in admiration, the fire which herself will teach them. Sarah said that everyone seemed to have heard about Sierra's teacher's reputation. But if you had any more questions, you could ask her directly. Sierra said goodbye to the deputy, who, saying that she needed to return to her duties, left the room. The crowd clung to the girl with enthusiasm, bombarding her with questions about what they would do now. At this time, Yolman tried in every possible way not to catch her eye. With her hands folded across her chest, Sierra was extremely serious. She explained that the students were free for today, and tomorrow, at 7 o'clock in the morning, they needed to gather at the training ground to practice fighting. After a moment of silence, she added that she hoped that the warriors would get along with each other, and if there were no more questions, those present could disperse. But the long-haired magician was not going to let her go so easily. He called out to Charlotte. She turned around, unhappy that she was distracted. He shouted that if they got into the ace class because of her strength, then why did that guy also pass? Naturally, he could not help but notice Yolman sneaking from the center of the hall, and in his speech he singled him out from the crowd. The apostle forced a smile. Calm down, you need to control yourself. Sierra looked at the guy in bewilderment, and asked what was wrong with him. Yolman was immediately buried under a heap of accusations. The crowd said that he had done nothing, that he was lustful like a wolf, that he pestered students every now and then, and that he was simply terrible. A blonde which immediately stood up for him. She said that it was a lie, that he was with her to help, and the rest was just an accident. Some student gasped, "What a kind goddess." Sierra quickly walked towards the apostle. At first he was internally horrified, but he thought that time he erased her memory, which means the girls shouldn't recognize him. The red-haired witch took a closer look, thoughtfully saying that the guy's face seemed familiar to her, and they could have met somewhere, but he waved his hands, saying that this was impossible, and she confused him with someone. Charlotte clearly didn't trust him and asked her question again. Yolman waved it off again. He would probably remember such a sweet girl. He definitely wouldn't forget. The guys from the crowd began to talk indignantly about how this guy dared to hit on the fiery witch herself. The teacher should not allow such a person to enter Ace's class. The girl raised her hand, beckoning them to remain calm. She would only place the guy in Ace's class temporarily. She said that the girl he saved explained that the student did not do anything wrong. In addition, he was the only one who dared to help her, and oppose Cerberus. This courage is not like that of an ordinary person. Yolman broke into a reverent smile and thanked Teacher Sierra for such a compliment. Charlotte challenged the crowd. If any of them are dissatisfied with her decision, let them try to convince her. The silence in the hall meant only one thing: there were no people willing to do this. The blonde magician clenched his teeth angrily. Finally, this long day ended and night came. Aces received Sierra and Sarah in his office. He, clasping his hands in front of him, asked if all those who fought in the battle against the Ice Dragon were included in Ace's class. Charlotte replied that it was true. She leaned forward worriedly and asked if it was possible that the apostle would also be among these disciples. The director sat back in his chair and asked how the entrance test went. Sarah revealed that there was a student in the test who could hold his own against Cerberus. She furrowed her brows and continued to say that they didn't see the moment when he was right in front of the dog, because the next second Cerberus flew so far away, as if his body was out of control. The old man thought for a moment and answered, if the monster flew away, then perhaps the student used the magic of talent spells that ordinary magicians cannot use, only a few, and very capable ones. Talent magic is the rarest type of magic. Sierra convinced herself that maybe this was true. Aces looked at the large grandfather clock opposite, and advised the girls not to think too much about the apostle, since it was already quite late, and sent them to rest. The witches bowed and prepared to leave, wishing the director good night and a good rest. A few seconds later the door slammed behind them. The old man muttered something into his beard. He reached into his desk drawer and took hold of the beautifully carved handle. In the box there was a lamp with a violet hellish flame blazing in it. Taking the jar in his hand, the director stared at the light, and his loud sigh echoed throughout the office. Yolman, dressed in an academy uniform, wandered sadly around the yard, complaining about having to get up so early. He yawned sweetly. He really wanted to sleep, but the dream immediately disappeared as soon as he noticed the blonde top of the head of the witch he had saved. Sparks danced in the eyes. This is yesterday's little sister. It's time to talk to the stranger. He ran towards her, shouting greetings as he went. He suddenly blushed deeply as he ran closer. The witch's chest swayed as soon as she turned around. The guy almost fainted from this sight. He was in heaven. The girl, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, asked in a gentle voice what he wanted. Yolman's cheeks turned red. He awkwardly recalled yesterday's incident on the test. The witch also blushed deeply. She denied it, and assured him that everyone had misunderstood everything, and it was she who should thank her savior. The student giggled and asked his name. Introducing herself, her name was Aisha. Yolman feverishly began to think about how not to pronounce his real name. He replied that his name was Lu, only his first name, no last name. Aisha noted that this name suits him. The apostle awkwardly scratched the back of his head, and offered to go to class together. A long-haired blonde man watched them from afar. He growled quietly, still dissatisfied with the presence of the impudent guy. Finally, the students gathered in the large hall. Sierra, standing in front of them, suggested starting the lesson. She, with her hands on her hips, conjured magic runes on the floor and announced that today the students would fight against each other, and their opponent would be. But Charlotte was unable to finish her sentence, because a huge fiery tiger jumped out onto the crowd right from the circle. The student, clearly one of the smartest in the class, noted that the young tiger, although an ordinary fire-type summon beast, had great fire power. The long-haired magician mockingly said that they would be dealing with one young tiger. Is this really fair to the tiger itself? Charlotte immediately retorted, she did not say that there would be one animal. A lottery will be held, according to which students will be divided into pairs. 2 people with the same number will form a group. While she was saying that within an hour they would have to defeat the tiger, more and more huge saber-toothed cats appeared behind her. Yolman unfolded the sheet. There was number 7. Aisha got the first number. The guy whined that fate was not at all favorable to him. Meanwhile, someone approached the witch. She turned around at the sound of footsteps. The long-haired magician bowed respectfully to her and introduced himself, saying that he was very lucky to be able to team up with such a beautiful miss. His name was Kyle, and the guy was the eldest son of the Smith family. But it seemed that the witch was not at all impressed by Kyle's attempts to charm her, and worriedly suggested that they first discuss battle strategy, because they had little time left. The magician waved his hand at those present and confidently replied that, compared to the others, he believed that to defeat the young tiger, one person would be enough for them, so let him figure it out. Aisha wanted to say something, but didn't have time. Kyle was already walking towards the tigers, leaving a final comment that it wouldn't take much time. He thought with a cheeky smile that with the strength of his family, he would deal with the tiger, and then this girl would take care of him. The magician stopped a few meters from the fiery tiger. He put his hand forward, casting a spell, saying that the animal looked very cute. The wind blade spell swept through the hall like a whirlwind towards the monster. Sierra, who was watching this, thought that Kyle's talent magic is a broken limiter. It can increase the outgoing magic attack by 1 level. Now, along with the increase effect, his attack level has increased to intermediate, or even to advance the magic of talent. Jan made a furrow in the stone floor with his claws, flying a couple of meters away. The wildcat's yellow eyes narrowed in rage. He roared and released a portion of a fiery flash from his mouth. Clenching his palms, Kyle called him a pathetic insect and created another spell. He threw a new stream of air directly at the tiger. The same one again sprinkled everything with fire. A wave of fire swept right near the crowd. The wind lifted the students' skirts, and they began to cover them with their hands, squealing. The guys coughed from the dust and fiery flashes. Kyle smiled smugly, saying that as he said, he managed to quickly deal with the monster. He slowly walked towards Aisha, saying how simple the training was, but she looked behind him in horror. the girl screamed, warning the magician of the danger. Kyle looked around sharply, not understanding what was happening. Suddenly, a completely alive and even more angry tiger, Yang, attacked him. The magician looked blankly at the approaching monster. The guy continued to awkwardly stagnate. It seems that he woke up only when he saw the monster flying towards him with outstretched paws. Tiger Yang knocked him to the ground. Hovering over Kyle, the animal released a deadly stream of fire from its mouth. A student from the crowd turned to Sierra with concern. The tiger would destroy the magician on the spot. But she didn't even react, but continued frowning to look at the battle. The entire hall was filled with a raging fire, and for a moment the silhouettes of the fighters disappeared from sight. Suddenly the tiger jumped back in shock, and then he flew back, thrown away by the airflow. Kyle, whose only clothes were damaged, stood with a victorious smile, his hands in his pockets. He was not going to die here. The guy approached Aisha, asking her opinion, because their team should be the first to complete this task. Charlotte approached the couple and called out to them. She congratulated the winners and allowed them to rest, since they were the second to complete this task. Kyle was incredibly surprised, as was the witch behind him. He immediately shouted that it was impossible, no one could do it faster than him, and that there was some kind of mistake. The teacher pointed somewhere to the side. That's where the team that completed it first was located. They had already completed the task, and were one step ahead of Aisha and Kyle. The latter kept repeating that this was impossible. When the enthusiastic crowd parted, they saw an incredible sight. The fire tiger, like a domestic cat, lay on his back, tossing and turning funny, and Lou and his partner stroked his belly and called him cutie. This is what happened 15 minutes ago. Still frustrated, Yolman bemoaned the inability to be paired with Aisha. Suddenly someone approached him, calling out to him. He turned around, asking who was speaking to him. A militant-looking student stood in front of him, holding an axe in her hands as if it weighed nothing, and boldly said that now they were in the same group, and the guy could call her Arya. But Yolman did not pay attention to her, but continued to sigh languidly for Aisha. This made the girl quite angry, and the rest of the students were now laughing at the couple. Hissing offendedly, Arya swung her weapon with all her might and charged straight at Lou to get his attention. But he didn't seem to notice anything around him. Finally, he sighed heavily. Then he stopped the axe flying at him with 2 fingers. Still looking at the piece of paper, the apostle assured that he had heard everything. Arya's face darkened. This guy. She, easily throwing the weapon on her back, mockingly said that she had heard that Lou was a pervert, causing him to cry out indignation. Turning around, the girl finally said that she alone could cope with the young tiger, and that her partner should not cause problems. He thoughtfully watched as Arya, armed with a weapon, walked towards the tiger. Could she really handle it alone? The student screamed and jumped straight at the animal. Then she lowered the axe with a crash, but not entirely successfully. Tiger Yang jumped aside. He roared, his fanged mouth opening. A shadow fell on the girl's face. Her eyebrows met on the bridge of her nose. She shifted her weight to her right leg, holding the base of the axe firmly in her hands. Then she sharply lunged with her foot right at the tiger's face. But with this Arya drove herself into a trap. A fiery vine closed on her ankle, the tail of a tiger. After a few seconds, the animal threw the student far back with its tail. Her axe, like a boomerang, spun in the air several times, and a little later she landed with a roar, hitting the marble floor, making a hole there. Regrouping, Arya found herself on her knees, the weapon falling right next to her. The next moment the tiger accelerated and pounced from a height directly at the girl. The student, weakened, clenched her teeth from powerlessness. She grabbed the base of the axe tightly and pointed it at the tiger. The animal bit into the wooden base with its teeth. His teeth were dangerously close to Arya's hand. The girl closed her eyes tightly, surrendering to chance. If only she were at least a little stronger. At that moment, when the tiger Yan had already begun to fall on the student, Yolman's voice was heard, turning to the wild cat, asking why she was cruel to his little sister. The guy's eyes sparkled dangerously. As if he was out of his mind, he muttered something about a little kitten. Suddenly the tiger loosened its grip, and even somehow, was taken aback. As usual, Yolman, with his hands in his pockets, rocked on his toes, and said that the matter with the tiger had been decided. Arya, opening one eye, stared at him in bewilderment, and then she discovered that opposite her was no longer a ferocious fire-breathing tiger, but an affectionate and playful cat. She pointed a shocked finger at the surprised monster, and hysterically asked what happened to it. Sierra, standing nearby, noted that the most difficult way to defeat a monster is to tame it. Aisha exclaimed enthusiastically, clapping her hands, that it was the first time she had seen a person do something like that. Kyle's eyes narrowed. He thought this was some kind of nonsense. He was seriously angry. Not only was he fighting, but these two were just lucky to meet a harmless animal. Meanwhile, Yolman and Arya were squatting next to the tamed tiger and scratching its belly. The long-haired magician walked up to Lu and said loudly that he was really jealous of him. Arya looked up at the guy. He asked with a wry smile why Lu was so lucky. Because he had met a harmless tiger. The apostle's partner stood up abruptly, attacking Kyle with accusations. At this time, the rest of the students also began to be indignant, saying that Kyle was right. Their team came across a very angry tiger. Some were even wounded during the battle. Yolman smiled and said that it was all about his magic, in the magic called taming the beast. Hearing this, Charlotte widened her eyes, staring at the guy. Kyle rolled his eyes. He had never heard of such talent magic. Could Lu demonstrate it to everyone to prove his words? The apostle grinned in response to this. The tiger lying on its back immediately stood up. All the tigers that took part in the test began circling Yolman. The crowd buzzed. What's going on with these fire cats? The apostle did not answer, and only looked to the side. As if on command, the entire pride lay down on the floor and bent in something like a bow in front of Yolman. He's smiling from ear to ear, quoted the saying, "If you see it, you won't believe it, but if you haven't seen it, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist." Hearing this, Kyle was overcome with anger of defeat and not understanding what was happening. Aisha seemed speechless from what she saw. Arya could also only open and close her mouth, silently watching what was happening. This pervert was hiding such power. The crowd was silent. The students just looked at Yolman with all their eyes. This scene was interrupted by Sierra. She had had enough. She created a magical circle of fire in the air. For today, the test was over, and all the tigers disappeared in the whirlpool of the magic circle. The teacher approached Lu and sternly asked when he would register his magic talent. The guy scratched his cheek and replied that no one asked him to do this. Charlotte took her leave and apologized to the students, as she urgently needed to visit the academic affairs department and add new information there. The girl dismissed the students, and she went to the exit. But the apostle thought that, fortunately for him, in one of the human novels that he read, there is the magic of talent taming, which means Sierra should not suspect anything. The sun illuminated the academy's courtyards. Arya, Yolman and Aisha were walking along the alley. Arya hit the guy hard on the shoulder and exclaimed that she did not expect such a pervert to have such strength, and that he was great. The apostle was indignant at this and asked not to call him that, because he had a name Lu. Aisha laughed softly, listening to their argument. The fun was interrupted by Kyle, who appeared in front of them. He dryly turned to Yolman that he now understood what kind of magic talent is, and it is not surprising that Cerberus did not attack him from the entrance test. The other students, hearing this, looked at each other. It really seemed like the truth. The apostle sighed. Well, it started again. The warriors continued to talk. Someone said that with the ability to control the summoned beast, that guy could send Cerberus to attack the others. He was told that Lu could deliberately do this in order to be able to touch the goddess. The apostle was amazed at how much human imagination can be developed. Arya spoke out in his defense, loudly saying that this couldn't happen, because if Cerberus had been set on the students, would they have been able to get through in that case? This made sense. The warriors did not know what to answer. Aisha could not tolerate injustice, and said that the magic of talent requires great abilities and long training. Besides, the wind barrier that time was unlikely to be able to withstand Cerberus, and Lu saved her, and the girl feels only gratitude. She expressed the hope that students will not make incorrect assumptions. Kyle growled at Aisha's words. She said that the wind barrier could not withstand. What impudence. The guy's fists involuntarily clenched, ready to fall on the enemy, whom they were also defending. He couldn't believe that the student was lying to help that freak. Yolman sincerely thanked the blushing Aisha, to which Arya jealously reminded of herself. There was silence in the director's office, interrupted only by the ticking of the large grandfather clock. Suddenly there was a knock on the door, and the director allowed him to enter. Sierra literally flew into the room with the words that she had found him, a man with the magic of taming talent. Aces straightened up in his chair in surprise, his clasped fingers tensed. The man clarified how strong the animals this student could control. Charlotte thought for a moment and answered, "It's not clear yet. It seems that he can instantly tame a beast like Cerberus. Aces ordered the teacher to find out this as quickly as possible. The trio of newfound friends strolled lazily around the building. Arya stretched sweetly, regretting that the time of rest was over so quickly. Aisha, studying the scroll in her hand, noticed that, if she was not mistaken, the class would be studying history today. When Lu asked again, she replied that she had heard that it was a subject that delved deeply into many major historical events. Yolman's eyebrows drew together, and he hoped that they wouldn't talk about the cities he bombed. Suddenly Arya saw Sierra and greeted her. Aisha and Yolman looked at each other. The guy drooped. He had a bad feeling. Charlotte immediately, without any ceremony, called the student to the court tower. The court tower inside was decorated with statues of 4 beautiful maidens on columns located around the arena with signs inscribed on it. Sierra and Lu found themselves right in the center of the arena. The area was also illuminated by 4 multicolored magic balls on high stands. Yolman smiled awkwardly. I wonder why Miss Sierra brought him to this place. The girl replied that she wanted to ask the student a question. Suddenly, a circle of fire formed around the arena, and the teacher herself rose into the air, and said her name in warning, then said that she would ask her question only once. Will Lu become the Fire Witch's apprentice? The guy was taken aback. It was very sudden. Sierra smiled triumphantly in advance. She was sure that no one would refuse to be the student of the great imperial magician. But her expectations were not met. Yolman crossed his arms in front of him, apologized, and refused. At first, the Fire Witch did not realize what exactly the guy answered. She smiled and asked to wait a little. But then the realization hit her mind. Sierra screamed, pointing her finger at Lu, who stood calmly. She was beside herself and shouted at Yolman, unable to believe that he dared to refuse. The guy rolled his eyes once again. Yes, he is only here to find a wife, and is not going to become someone's apprentice and work hard. Suddenly his eyes sparkled. Lu thought out loud that there was no rule prohibiting a student and teacher from getting married, but Charlotte did not support this idea, warning the student not to even think about it. The apostle exhaled in disappointment. What a pity. He turned around and waved his hand, telling Sierra to forget about it. The witch, irritated, clenched her teeth. She ironically asked how Lu even planned to find a wife with his status. The girl invited him to remember how the guy lived before he got to this academy. Yolman lowered his head and indulged in memories of the time when he first came into the world of people. Huge price tags, larger than the records of the apostles. He passed by shop windows, and was horrified by the prices of ordinary cakes. A large commission that took most of his coins. He vividly imagined Aisha running away from him into the distance because he was too poor and therefore they could not be together. Yolman raised his head to the ceiling and screamed in horror that this would never happen. Sierra smiled contentedly. She still managed to appeal to the student's voice of reason. She raised her finger up and offered a deal. If Lu became her student, he would gain status and access to her property. She ascended upward again, and fire began to blaze around her, and fiery flashes also erupted from her hands. The witch asked her question again. Is Lu ready to become Sierra Charlotte's apprentice? Without turning around, the apostle's voice rang out, asking Miss Sierra if she really thought that this was the only way to convince him. Turning around, he smiled wickedly, and at the same moment, like a child, he ran with a squeal to the teacher. He agreed to become a student of the Master Sierra. The witch was loudly indignant when she realized that Lu had simply jumped and grabbed her leg. The next moment they both fell to the floor, Yolman tightly hugging his teacher's hips with both hands. The guy also demanded encouragement from the master. At that same second, various magical symbols and constellations began to appear on the ceiling, shimmering in blue. The immobilized Sierra said that the student might not bow to her, and he should have already unhooked from her. An absolutely happy Yolman, without letting go of Sierra, asked what was wrong with the student holding the master's hips. Suddenly, fiery flashes began to burst out along the entire perimeter of the circle in which they lay. The apostle looked around in surprise, not understanding what was happening. The flashes became larger and larger, and were now jumping all over the hall, like sunbeams. Sierra hissed that Lu was an idiot. Finally, they were both covered with a dome of fire, and one of the statues on the column said in a dull voice that the contract had been concluded. Yolman felt his forehead feel hot. A mark appeared there that looked like a small fiery dragon. He slapped himself with his palm. Something strange had happened to his forehead. Sierra, freed from the hug, was beside herself with rage. She grabbed the apprentice by the scruff of the neck and began shouting that when a contract is made between a master and an apprentice, A mark of the contract appears in the place where they touched. The guy, embarrassed, quietly noticed that Charlotte had not warned him. The witch, realizing that nothing could be changed, sighed and released the unlucky student. Wearily putting her hand to her face, she said that, in any case, this mark does not appear just like that. Yolman, hearing this, jumped up and down enthusiastically, asking if this meant that Sierra's mark was on her thigh. But the girl ordered him to get away. A day later in the academic cafeteria, 2 students from Sierra's class were talking among themselves. They were discussing Lu's invitation to the court tower yesterday, and the fact that it seemed that he had not returned from there yet. Arya and Aisha couldn't stomach it. The girls sadly thought about the fate of their friend. Arya belligerently exclaimed that in the court tower, the Royal Academy judges and punishes students. Aisha clutched the hem of her dress, nervously protesting that the guy had done nothing wrong. Kyle, who approached them, intervened in the conversation. He laughed when he heard what the girls were talking about. He smiled evilly and said that Lu must have lied about his taming talent magic, and it was discovered, and now the lower strata are worried about each other. Raising an eyebrow, he added that he must have been expelled yesterday. After all, trash is still trash. Arya jumped up from the table and loudly, screaming, asked him what the hell he was talking about. Aisha tried to calm her classmate, but she failed. Kyle could not stop, and threw mud at the student, calling them, like Lu, trash. The blonde witch tried to protect the apostle. She objected to Kyle that he himself had seen the magic of Lu's talent with his own eyes, and it would be better for him to watch his words. At that moment Yolman's voice was heard. He asked if everyone was talking about him. Kyle, narrowing his eyes, looked carefully at the guy who entered. The apostle, as always, was calm and kept his hands in his pockets. He said that he had only been gone one night, but they had already missed each other at the same time. He pressed his back against the wall and languidly put his palm to his forehead. The guy had an impressive bag of money hanging on his belt. Aisha jumped out from the table and rushed to Lu. He clapped his hands. His little sister, as always, remained a cutie. Arya put her hands on her hips and said reproachfully that Lu was still just as lustful. The guy repelled the attack with a smile, calling his partner still just as cruel and active. With her hands folded across her chest, Arya, with feigned indifference, asked Lu to tell him why teacher Sierra took him away yesterday. Kyle, whom no one had asked, butted in again, mockingly asking what the student and teacher were doing there. He assumed that Lu had been expelled from the academy. Aisha sobbed, "This is not true." The apostle arched an eyebrow and looked at the offender. Then he raised his head high and said that Master Sierra had entered into a contract with him. In the dining room, where most of the students were intently following the progress of the conversation, silence reigned. All eyes were focused on Lu, a contract between master and student. The apostle summoned magical streams of fire. That same mark appeared on his forehead. It would prove to everyone that the guy was not lying. Kyle, pretending to be unimpressed, said that even if his classmate had the magic of taming animals, he was just lucky that there were animals on the test, because if it were different, would he have gotten into Ace's class? The guy bared his teeth and invited Lu to fight him. Kyle Smith. Aisha could not remain silent when her savior was insulted, so, clenching her fists, she replied that even so, Lu has the magic talent sufficient to enter the Ace class. The apostle looked admiringly at the girl who defended him so zealously. The long-haired magician sharply moved his palm, causing a magical flow of air. He, like a knife, rushed towards Aisha and cut off several strands of her hair. Lu and Arya immediately grouped up and ran up to their friend. Kyle, shaking his palm, sharply told the offended witch not to interfere in someone else's conversation when she was not asked to do so. Arya ran up to Aisha, excitedly asking if she was okay. The girl timidly nodded. The apostle moved closer to Kyle to talk. He agreed to fight the magician. Then, a spark ran through the red eyes. He seriously asked Mr. Kyle to be gentle with him. The wind currents created by Kyle gradually dissipated. He and Lu now stood opposite each other, each looking at the other with his eyes. Yolman folded his arms across his chest and asked what the rules and conditions of their fight would be. Smith replied that he would release the maximum of his energy and strike. If Lu survives, it means victory, and if he loses, he will immediately leave the Ace class. Arya clenched her fist. What a vile magician this is. Now there is not a single monster there. This is completely unfair to Lu. Aisha, frightened, did not say anything, only looked pitifully at Lu. Yolman was not at all afraid. he said with a smile that Mr. Kyle looked confident. He laughed mockingly right in his classmate's face. At first he continued to stand motionless. Then air magic runes formed in the air. From the small whirlwind that appeared, the magician took out a superbly constructed sword. The apostle raised his eyebrows in surprise. Aisha, who had retreated to a safe distance, stood at the stands, but when she saw the appearance of weapons, she jumped up and shouted that this could not happen. Arya, who was standing behind her, asked what was the matter. The witch, looking somewhere into the distance, told a legend. One day, the ancestor of the Bolette family received an elemental gift from the king, countless amounts of gold and silver that did not fit in the carved chests, and one of the rarest treasures is a magic sword. Aisha wondered if she remembered the exact name of the weapon. It was him, that same famous and unattainable Excalibur. Yolman smiled slyly, saying that Kyle had an interesting sword. He, biting his index finger, set new conditions. If he lost, he would not only leave the class, but also leave the academy. Holding Excalibur in front of him, the blonde responded defiantly that Lou had finally realized that he didn't belong here. Yolman ignored the attack, but offered to get his sword from Kyle if he won. The magician tensed when he heard such a proposal, not that he was unsure of himself. At the podium, Arya screamed in her usual manner, calling Lou a pervert and wanting him to deal with Kyle. The apostle broke into a smile and mockingly asked Kyle if he thought he could lose. The wounded blonde clicked his teeth and accepted the conditions. He told his opponent not to blame him for the lack of beasts that could help block Excalibur. Kyle, twirling the sword in his hand, urged Lou not to ask for mercy. Smith, moving the sword in front of him, began to cast spells in the ancient language. Yolman, standing calmly in the same place, watching this, noticed that the weapon released magical energy quite well. The girls caught their breath from the tension hanging in the air. Kyle swung with all his might, and he rushed with his sword to the advantage of the apostle, while using the air sentence spell. Yolman only grinned at this attack. He lazily extended his left hand and held it out in front of Kyle. In a matter of seconds, the apostle created a fiery shield, which Kyle, unsuspecting, hit with all his might with his sword. The magician exhaled in shock. The streams of air from his magic covered Aisha and Arya with their heads. The air cloud completely hid the battlefield and the fighting students. The girls leaned forward, trying to at least make out something. Who is who? Kyle looked blankly in front of him. How could this bastard? The apostle, hiding his eyes under his bangs, said that they should not waste time. Smith stared in shock at his opponent. Lou, meanwhile, was already holding the sword in his hands, carefully stroking the blade, saying that he would accept Excalibur. He mockingly continued, thanking Mr. Kyle for his generosity and gift, while Kyle stood opposite him and furiously clenched and unclenched his fists. Arya and Alicia, jumping up and down with anticipation, loudly asked Lou if he was okay. Yolman turned his head to Kyle, recalled the attack towards Aisha, and expressed hope that this would not happen again. At the same time, his red eyes lit up with a dangerous fire. The blonde still seemed unable to accept his defeat and looked at Lou with wide eyes. Yolman, seeing how the enemy was approaching him again, sharply extended his right hand, without releasing Excalibur from his left. A powerful fiery blow struck Kyle's chest, and he was thrown back. The guy spat out blood from his mouth. Such was the strength of the enemy's spell. Smith flew quite a distance, and in the end, with a deafening roar, it hit the opposite wall, partially destroying it. Aisha and Arya opened their mouths in shock. Kyle lay defeated, spitting out more and more blood. Yolman lowered his hand and smiled. Well, that's all. The clouds of dust cleared and everyone saw Kyle, bloodied, lying on the floor. He got up on all fours, spitting out blood again. The magician raised his head, and a veil of rage covered his eyes. This is impossible. Yolman smiled contentedly, examining Excalibur, and said that he was taking it. The answer was Smith's furious look. At that moment, Lou was called out. He turned around and saw Arya and Aisha running. Arya couldn't believe her eyes. She excitedly asked if Lou was really taking Excalibur. Aisha, smiling sweetly, praised her classmate, saying that he turned out to be stronger than she thought. He blushed and replied that he was actually very strong. Arya had another brilliant idea and raised her index finger. The girls suggested throwing a party in honor of Lou's victory, since they didn't have any more classes for today anyway. Yolman's eyes sparkled. He imagined an incredible amount of varied food, and was already looking forward to trying it. The trio turned to leave, shouting slogans of victory along the way. A thin stream of blood flowed down Klein's chin. He thought with horror what would happen to him if his father found out about the loss of Excalibur. Then he took a deep breath into his lungs and, shouting as much as he could, ordered the students to stop. Yolman stopped and turned around. Wiping his chin with the back of his hand, the fair-haired magician told the apostle that he could not give this sword to him. Aisha spoke up. She recalled that this was a condition to which Smith agreed, and she hoped that the guy would be able to keep his word. Klein, annoyed, shouted that Lou had definitely cheated somehow, and just to be fair, the sword must be returned. Yolman firmly replied that he refused. Smith was amazed at such audacity. He immediately began to create magical currents of air, thereby announcing the battle. A large ball formed in the hands of the magician, an accumulation of his forces and a powerful weapon. The guy shouted to Lou, even if he didn't think that he would leave this sight unscathed. The trio found themselves right in the middle of a raging wind whirlwind. Arya said loudly through the noise of the wind that Cain would definitely not allow himself to lose his sword, but a retaliatory strike was already levitating in Yolman's palm, magical fire clots. He, smiling, assured that nothing would work out for Smith. The apostle gripped the hilt of the sword more tightly with his second hand. He glanced down. He felt some kind of energy from outside. Kyle again created a vortex of air around himself, and told Lou that he would spare him if he obediently returned the sword to him. He arched his eyebrow and asked what would happen if he refused. Then Smith roared that the student would die on the spot. He was so angered by Lou's arrogance that he created one of his most powerful spells, the Wind Whirlwind Blade. The apostle watched the brewing storm with an unreadable expression on his face. The girls prepared to shield themselves from the wind with their hands. But suddenly, Kyle's magic connected with something previously unknown to those present. The area around them was filled with a bright, green color, and Kyle screamed in shock, asking what was happening. Excalibur, which now rose above the warring parties, shone brighter than the sun. The tip of the handle with the precious stones shimmered and began to pulsate. Yolman stood closest to the light source and looked at it unblinkingly. Aisha covered her eyes with her palms, unable to bear the glow. The apostle chuckled in surprise when he saw what was happening. In place of the sword, a cocoon formed, which rotated at great speed. It was possible to distinguish the outlines of a person who was sitting inside in a fetal position. A few moments later, the cocoon dissipated and a girl with green hair appeared to those present. Her clothes were in the same colors and details as Excalibur earlier. The stranger landed softly on the floor. Bending one knee, she lowered her head in front of Yolman and introduced herself. The girl was the embodiment of the sword of the king of the elements named Sylph, and she welcomed the new owner. Arya leaned forward, amazed, and asked her what kind of sword she was talking about. Aisha opened her mouth in silent surprise. Kyle, too, can't utter a word from what he saw. Sylph flew closer to the apostle. He thoughtfully rested his chin on his index finger, and asked if the girl was the spirit of this magical sword. She nodded and replied that, according to her agreement with Kyle, now she, the sword of the king of the elements, would belong to Lou. Sylph also clarified whether she could find out about her master's wishes. Arya noticed that the sword had a spirit. No wonder it was considered a precious treasure. Yolman scratched the back of his head and first asked Sylph to stand up. She obediently obeyed. Kyle was now no longer conscious of rage. The magician jumped up and ran to the spirit, saying that he was her master. The girl turned around upon hearing these words. The magician continued, waving his arms, shouting that he definitely would not have lost to that guy if she had shown up earlier, and Sylph ordered to return to him immediately. Arya put her hands on her hips and said in disappointment that Kyle was really so shameless to say such a thing. Aisha was silent, and only nodded at her friend's words. Yolman turned to the spirit, deciding that it would be better if she weighed everything herself, and asked if the girl wanted to return.